Welcome to the HR Stories podcast, listener question edition, where there is a lesson in every story. Each week, the team at HR Stories podcast shares questions from our podcast audience and provides tangible, practical advice that everyone can use to get HR right. Our hosts today are management and HR consultants Chuck Simikian and John Tallheimer. What is on your mind today? Welcome to the HR Stories podcast, question and answer edition, where there is a lesson in every question. My name is John Tallheimer, and I am with HR in Paradise, Mr. Chuck Simikian.
Hello. Hello.
Our producer is not going to like my lighting today, Chuck.
Well, you know what? It's fine. There's some vintageness to it, John.
It's a vintage. It's vintage. We got a big announcement coming up. We're going to hold off for a little bit, but we got a big announcement about something for my life, something big that's happening. But we'll hold off on that announcement until
big
announcement.
So, all right, John, we got our 3 questions.
All right.
So I'll kick it off with question number 1. Can I, as an exempt employee, salaried exempt employee, also work as a non-exempt employee performing a separate job with the same company? So I'm a salaried employee, and I see this a lot throughout my career. Can I work as a non-exempt employee performing a separate job within the same company?
Can you?
Payroll. Well, I don't know. Can I? No, probably not. But you teach payroll law. What do you think? Can I?
It worries me, right? It worries me when I see it. Is it legal? Maybe, right? I mean, again, how is that person being treated? How separate are the jobs? I would advise my clients, right? If I'm working as a client, I'm going to say, no, you're not going to allow that to happen because It's such this, one, you're telling this employee, okay, I need you. You're a non-exempt employee. You're exempt employee. Sorry, you're exempt from overtime. You're going to work as many hours as you need to get it done. And then I'm going to start tracking your hours for this position. If the Department of Labor comes knocking at your door, they're going to be like, why are you tracking that employee's time? And how do you know when they're doing that work versus the other work? Right. And so that's my kind of take on it. I wouldn't do it. Another question that comes up a lot, Chuck, is can I, as an employee, work as an independent contractor for the same company?
Yeah.
And so, I know people that do it. I've heard it, but again, it makes me nervous.
Yeah. And it depends the scope of that other job. I got to tell you, I used to work at this place called the River Ranch. It was a dude ranch here in Florida, down in, River Ranch, Florida. And I remember they would have this hayride every night, and they had the singing cowboy. And I remember when I started there as the HR person, I'm like, all right, the singing cowboy, this sounds great. And get on, and there's a guy with a cowboy hat, big mustache, and he's sitting on this speaker, and everyone's in the big hayride, and it's like karaoke. He starts singing, and we're all going along. I thought, wait a second. That's the plumber. That guy is the plumber during the day in the maintenance department. And what he was doing was he was moonlighting as a singing cowboy. So he had a contract, is a completely different job, different, it was, so in that regard, okay, we get it. I think most people will get it. But overall, answering this question specifically, I would say my rule of thumb would be no, absolutely not. Most companies that have payroll systems, you couldn't even do that, okay? You couldn't even do that. You have to create 2 separate accounts, and it wouldn't let you clock in and also have a salaried employee. It just wouldn't do it. It's not only a bad idea, but it's definitely against the law. Or you know what, you would lose your exemption,
Yeah,
the salary exemption on the other side, and they say that's fine, you can do that job, but you're going to be either hourly altogether. Sometimes, John, there's chances where like it's all hands on deck. Oh my gosh, we need banquet service. Chuck, can you run food out or bus tables? What's an hourly job, but I'm not getting any extra money or time. I'm just doing this job to help out the company.
right. But
So
you could, right? I mean, if you wanted, like, if you did that, Chuck, right? And so maybe you came in on a Saturday and worked as a busser just because it needed to be done. The company could come and say, hey, Chuck, we're going to give you a little bonus because you did that.
Sure.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. And the other part of this conversation, just I don't want to leave the nonprofits out of this conversation, because one of the big things with nonprofits is, can one of my employees also work as a volunteer? Right. And so let's say you're having a big event. You're having a big event and your accountant wants a volunteer to bus tables, as we're on the subject, right? Wants a volunteer to do that. You have to be really clear what is the volunteer activity and what is the employee activity, right? You got to make sure those two things are clear. Otherwise, that's when we get in trouble.
Yeah. Great answers all around.
Yeah. Good conversation. Good question, I think.
Question 2. We hired someone as a salaried exempt employee, but 10 months after he started, we noticed, I don't know how they noticed this, but we noticed that his job description changed and reclassified him as non-exempt. Do we need to pay him overtime when he was considered salaried exempt? And I'm just going to say, John, when I read this question, the key to me was his job description changed.
Yeah.
I don't know how they noticed it, but apparently.
How many times, right? How many times in HR we're talking to a manager or supervisor and they're like, oh, that job's different now.
Yeah.
And we're like, well, when did that happen? Oh, 3 months ago. Why didn't you tell? Oh, I forgot. I got busy. I wasn't thinking about it, right? And so a lot of times these things happen, right? The managers aren't telling us, and maybe that's what happened. We noticed. And so to me, I'm going to go back, right? I'm going to be honest about this, and I'm going to go back and go, when did that change happen? And let's say it did happen 3 months ago. And then I'm going to be like, all right, well, for those 3 months, I would need to be paying that person overtime. And I would go back and I would say, all right, how many hours did you work these weeks? And I wouldn't tell them why. I just like, hey, tell me how many hours you worked, for the last 3 months. Every week, I want to know what that was. It's the best to your knowledge what that was. And then I would go back and I would present them with a big check and say, hey, we're going to make you non-exempt going back to retroactively to this date. And here's the check because of all the hours you worked for overtime, and just move on.
Yeah. And you know what that is? You may not get it 100% accurate, but you've provided a good faith effort. And we've talked about how good faith effort can shield you from a lot of fines and penalties. So good. I like that. Yeah. Quick, easy answer for question number 2.
Okay.
Now, this one I'm not as familiar with, although there are some nuances here. So question 3, is an anniversary bonus considered discretionary or non-discretionary?
Yeah. And so the question becomes, why are you asking? Right. And so I think this was one of my questions. I think this came from one of my classes, and we were talking about calculating the regular rate.
Yeah.
All right. And so remember, let's go back. Let's make sure that our listeners here, when we're calculating regular rate, right? So when we're thinking about overtime and it's 1.5 times their regular rate, that's not 1.5 times their hourly salary. That's 1.5 times their hourly salary plus any bonuses, non-discretionary bonuses they got, right? Yeah. And so do we include the anniversary bonus in that? We don't. It's not included in the regular rate. And so it's probably a non-discretionary bonus because you're basing it on performance or tenure with the company, and so they're automatically going to get it. Right? That you work for 5 years, you automatically get it. It's tied to some kind of fact, so it's a non-discretionary bonus. You can't be like, I'm not going to give it to you today, right? So it's not a discretionary bonus, but it is not included in the regular rate. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, and I got to tell you, it's so confusing still in a lot of ways, but if you sit and you listen and you actually think it through, it will make sense. But one of the best things that I like is finally, and I don't like ADP Workforce Now system that much, but there is one thing they do really well, John, is they have figured out how to calculate the regular rate for all these nuancy type of things. And it's absolutely wonderful. So we don't have to worry about that. So if you have ADP Workforce Now, not an endorsement, but congratulations. But if you don't, and even if you do, you really need to understand this. So the nice thing about the HR Stories podcast is you can rewind and listen to John's explanation 1 million times.
Yeah, and I mean, again, right, when you're calculating pay, it's easy when they work less than 40 hours, boom, they're done. They work over 40 hours and they didn't get a bonus during that period. Boom, it's done. It's 1.5 times their salary. Simple. But what if they're working 2 jobs, right? Now we have to calculate the regular rate. And so we got to figure out what that is. And so having a calculator to do that, having a salary calculator to do that is good. I love that you have a third-party company doing that for you, Chuck, right? And it does get complicated. But understanding the difference between non-discretionary and discretionary bonus is really important. Mm-hmm. And so again, non-discretionary is typically tied to performance, and discretionary is really at the sole discretion of the boss, the supervisor, plus basically going, I'm going to decide to give you a bonus today. Chuck, you were great today on the podcast. I'm going to give you a little bit of bonus. Fantastic, right? I'm not tying that to anything, that kind of stuff. And so just being very clear with that. And I would be clear in my employee handbook. This is what a non-discretionary bonus is. This is what a discretionary bonus is. If we give one out, we may not. And so just being aware of that.
All right. This has been great. 3 great questions.
Yeah.
3 or more answers, because HR is never really black and white. There is black and white in that gray, but you got to find it. And I think we covered some of that today. So excellent. Folks, you've been listening to the HR Stories podcast, our weekly Q&A edition. Stay tuned for next week when you're going to hear another great story on the HR Stories podcast, where there's a lesson in every story.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Thank you for listening to the HR Stories podcast. The material presented in this podcast is for informational purposes only. Chuck and John always recommend using an employment lawyer or HR consultant to handle any legal concerns or HR issues. We do our best to double check sources and make sure the information we are providing is accurate. We may eliminate or embellish without changing the basic narrative to make the story easier to understand. In certain circumstances, we may change identifying information to protect the innocent. The HR Stories broadcast is brought to you by the team at HR Stories. The team at HR Stories is designed to help anyone with HR responsibilities be better at managing the employee experience. To engage with us, go to the hrstoriesteam.com and learn more about how the team at HR Stories can support your business or nonprofit. Thank you for listening to the HR Stories podcast, where there is a lesson in every story.